Welcome to this month's Voices of the AAPI Community Briefing with critical insights on timely policy issues impacting our nation. My name is Sarah Sadwani. I'm a political science professor at Pomona College, and I will be your moderator for today. We have some fantastic folks that are going to be joining us, both to present the data as well as to discuss the impacts of this data. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our partners, AAPI Data, APIAVote, Asian American Journalists Association, and NCAPA for today's briefing, and the Associated Press and NORC for their ongoing partnership. The Voices of AAPI briefings are an incredibly important resource of data and insights for our communities regarding timely policy and social issues. And I'd like to start us off today by welcoming our Karthik Ramakrishnan, our founder and executive director of AAPI Data, to get us started and to review the main findings of the survey. Karthik, you want to take it away?
Thank you so much, Sarah, and pleasure to be here with you. And thank you for your thought leadership in API communities and political behavior and public opinion. More generally, looking forward to your moderation of the conversation later today. So before we dive into the survey data, and I want to make sure that people understand the different types of data that we have that we hope will be timely and useful to all of you. As we navigate uncharted waters in our country, seemingly every week there's a new policy issue where we're seeing some dramatic changes. So one of the resources we have is called a resource guide. We have a lot of different types of data, from demographic data to program and utilization data to policy information to survey data on a particular topic. Instead of having you hunt around on different parts of our website, downloading PDFs to get all this information, we've created a handy set of resource guides. And just earlier today, we released a resource guide on education as a topic. So let's go to the next slide, please. So if you go to our main page, you will see the resource guide right there with that handy animation. And if you click on that, you'll be able to get to our resource guides. Some of our resource guides pertain to issues and others pertain to particular communities. We also have a community data explorer. And again, if you go to our main page, let's go to the next slide, please. You will see that community data explorer. And we have some exciting news where we not only have data that is disaggregated by population at the national level, the state level, the county level, the metropolitan area level. We now have it for congressional district. We also have it for state legislative district. So for all of you that are trying to be more effective in talking to elected officials in various levels of government to address the needs of our communities, you have population data at all those levels. We also have indicator data. So for example, limited English proficiency. We saw an executive order declaring English the official language of the United States. Doesn't seem to do a whole lot right away, although we're already seeing reductions in language access on a variety of topics from the federal government. You can get language access data at all of those levels of geography where the sample sizes are large enough by detailed origin. And then at the congressional and state legislative district level, you can get it at the level of race. So for example, Asian limited English proficiency or NHPI limited English proficiency. And a lot of the findings might surprise you. In several congressional districts and legislative districts, Asian Americans have higher language needs than Latinos. So this is something that we hope will be helpful to all of you in the work that you do. Next slide, please. Then finally, survey data, right? So this is our data release in March with data that was collected in February. We're going to have upcoming survey releases in April, May, and July. So far from the problem of not having enough data or people saying that they don't know where our community stands because we just don't have the data, we have the honor and privilege of working with the Associated Press and NORC to be able to conduct regular surveys on timely topics, such as the one we're going to talk about today. Next slide. So if you go to our website, so soon after this briefing, you'll see updated resources, including a presentation slide deck, as well as disaggregated data from the questions that we cover in this presentation, as well as the larger survey. So if you click on data, you go to surveys, and you go to the particular survey that you're interested in, you will find all of those resources. Next slide. So let's get right to it in terms of some of the main findings from our most recent release. Next slide. So our top level findings are that our communities believe that government spending should focus on social issues as opposed to military spending, which is very different from how the policy debate on the budget is proceeding in Washington, D.C. right now. We also find that economic and kitchen table issues dominate, with the cost of healthcare, food, and housing as top priorities for Congress to address. We also find lack of support for various aspects of the Department of Government Efficiency, or so-called DOGE initiative, with most opposed to federal agency elimination and steep cuts to federal workers. At the same time, most ANHPIs see problems with the federal bureaucracy, with issues like corruption, inefficiency, and government red tape getting frequent mention. And finally, on the issues of immigration and healthcare, we find that ANHPIs indicate more progressive views than the general public on particular ways that we ask that question. Next slide. So here are just some of the top lines. Next slide. So when it comes to how much of a priority for Congress or the federal government should addressing the following be, we find that the cost of healthcare dominates. Again, this is not always what we're seeing in terms of news coverage or rhetoric coming out of DC, but the cost of healthcare is top of mind for our community members, followed closely by the cost of food and the cost of housing. Of course, there are other costs that are also concerning that our community says should be a high priority for Congress to address. Next slide. Importantly, there's bipartisan support for Congress to address some of these key drivers. So we find, especially when it comes to healthcare, housing, and food, you see a majority of not only AAPI Democrats, but AAPI Republicans and AAPI Independents saying that these are priority issues. Next slide. If you look at the current budget fight, there's so much talk about cuts in social programs. But what we find instead is our community believes that the federal government is spending too much on the military, armaments, and defense, and not enough money on the nation's education system, on protecting the nation's health, protecting the environment, and addressing the problem of homelessness. Next slide. On the topic of government efficiency, there is very little support, and in fact, there is supermajority opposition to eliminating entire federal agencies. We did not ask about any agency in particular. We will be asking about that in a future survey, so stay tuned, including on departments like the Department of Education and USAID. But looking at the data we have, we see opposition to eliminating entire federal agencies, much more opposition than support for eliminating a large number of federal jobs. Our community is split on moving federal agencies outside of Washington, D.C., as well as requiring federal workers to return to the office 5 days a week. Next slide. At the same time, so if you put all this together, they want the federal government to do more in terms of addressing social needs. They think government has a problem, right, in terms of corruption, efficiency, and red tape. And yet at the same time, they think that DOGE is going too far, right? So we see that the supermajority says that corruption and inefficiency are major problems in the federal government. So this is something that decision makers and leaders will have to grapple with in terms of the complicated terrain when it comes to government efficiency, government performance, and budget and government priorities. Next slide. So we had a bunch of questions on healthcare, including the so-called Make America Healthy Again agenda. And what we find that API adults are more likely than the national average to express concern about declining vaccination rates leading to infectious disease outbreaks and deaths. And notice that while Democrats are at 78% here, at extremely concerned or very concerned, close to a majority of API Republicans are also extremely concerned and very concerned. Importantly, this data was collected in early February of 2025 for the API population, and that was prior to the more recent measles outbreaks in Texas and elsewhere. Let's go to the next slide. We also see that API adults want to restrict the use of processed food. So it's a little bit of a mixed picture, right? So it's not opposing everything under that broad rubric of the Make America Healthy Again agenda. And you see some other opinion points there, including very little support for removing fluoride from drinking water, reconsidering government recommendations for widely used vaccines, and removing restrictions on the sale of unpasteurized or raw milk. Next slide. We also find that API Republicans are more likely to support removing fluoride from drinking water than Democrats. So there is a kind of partisan split here. And that's something that we're seeing as a recurring pattern over the last couple of years, is that partisanship ends up being one of the strongest predictors of differences in opinion. At the same time, when it comes to removing restrictions on the sale of raw milk, there's not much of a partisan difference, at least in terms of favoring removing those restrictions, although you do see a difference in opposing removing those restrictions, with Democrats much more likely to be opposed. One final thing I'll say in many of these slides is you will see a chunk of people that are neither favor nor oppose. And what that often reflects is either lack of awareness on that topic or having insufficient information to be able to make a decision. Next slide. In terms of who is responsible for high healthcare costs, our communities, similar to the US average, although slightly more so in some cases, believe that it's pharmaceutical companies and private health insurers that are responsible, and they're less likely to think of healthcare providers as extremely responsible or very responsible for high healthcare costs. Next slide. And then finally, in terms of who do they trust to do what is right for them and their family, APIs, similar to the national average, are much more likely to trust doctors and nurses and pharmacists than they are to trust health insurance providers and hospital executives. Next slide. We have a few questions on immigration. In fact, almost in every survey now, we have some topic related to immigration, given how it's affecting our communities. Overall, we find that our communities want to keep the number of green cards the same or increase. Only 12% want the number of green cards to decrease. Similarly, only 16% want the number of worker visas sponsored by US employers to decrease. In terms of family visas, only 15% want to see a decrease. And similarly, only 15% want to see a decrease in the number of student visas for individuals attending US universities. The reason why we thought it was important to do this is that if you look at the first Trump administration, and if you look at plans already that are starting to take shape, it is very likely that we're going to start seeing a reduction in the number of student visas, in the number of H-1B visas, and in the number of green cards that are issued on an annual basis. Next slide. Finally, on immigration, we find that API adults are less likely than the national average to say that police in their community should always cooperate with federal immigration authorities. So it's 31% for API adults versus 42% for US adults who say that police should always cooperate with federal immigration authorities. There's a big partisan skew here with Republicans, a majority of Republicans saying that police should always cooperate with federal immigration authorities. Next slide. Okay, I guess that's it. I thought there was going to be one other immigration topic, but I'm glad to kick it back to you, Sarah, and look forward to the conversation and reactions from our distinguished panel.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Karthik, for leading us through all of this incredible data. It gives us a really great sense of kind of where the community lies on so many of the hottest issues, hot button issues that we're seeing here across the United States, of course, and really taking a look at in the ways in which our community diverges from sort of the general narrative that is often being put forward. I want to bring into the conversation now two of the leading voices within the API community. We'll start with Bob Sakaniwa from APIAVote, the Director of Policy and Advocacy. We'll also bring into the conversation Greg Orton from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans and CAPA, who serves as the National Director. And we found out recently that Greg and I used to work together quite a long time ago, so it's really exciting to be back and sharing this space with you, Greg. I want to start with you, Bob, and just first of all, just give us some of your general reactions to some of the data that Karthik has laid out here, given the work that you are doing at APIAVote. What stands out to you from this data?
Sure, thanks so much, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And as an organization, API serving organization, especially in the civic engagement space, this type of information is invaluable in reaching out to our communities. There are such generalized messages out there, swaying voters one way or another on any topic you want to consider under the sun, but it's really kind of drilled down information like this. And as somebody commented in the chat, not just about the API community, but disaggregated information on the API community, which is that much more important, since nobody else is really doing this work. And I know Karthik's been doing it for a long time. And so we really have to take advantage of these surveys and really use it to help better communicate with our community about what's going on in the policy realm, whether it's federal, state, or local. And I think this survey conducted last month, I think really underscores the importance of knowing where communities stand on these issues. I think it is true, while there are some differences, there are a lot of areas that it kind of reaffirms our community being somewhat reflective of the broader mainstream electorate. But obviously in certain areas like immigration, we do see a difference, and I think for clear reasons. I also feel like we just went through a very or in Congress anyways, a very difficult process finishing out the budget for this year in the stopgap measure that was passed about a week ago. But in that debate, you can see all these pressing issues on, do we want to spend more money on social programs, or are we going to spend more on the military? All of that played out in the stopgap debate. And I think a lot of the reasons there was so much anger pushed against Senate Democrats, who ultimately ensured that this stopgap measure passed. The anger was because there was an imbalance. Continuing resolution or stopgap measure is not supposed to really favor any one program or department or what have you. But what we saw in this effort was a complete, uh, essentially codifying what's happening now with DOGE, which is taking away money from important federal programs on the one hand, and yet still being able to give military spending the boost that they always claim to need. So just from a very top line view, I think this is a very important survey underscoring and amplifying some of these issues that we're all trying to get a better focus on.
Great. And I'll just follow up, Bob. I'm curious, you're at APIAVote. Obviously, your organization is focused so much on mobilizing the Asian American and Pacific Islander vote across America. When you talk about these sort of discrepancies that we're seeing in this data, and in particular, you mentioned the social versus military spending and how this is really out of alignment. The budget that has been passed is out of alignment in many ways with the perspectives of Asian Americans, according to this data. Do you see this as an opportunity to mobilize Asian Americans towards 2026? I know we're only here in 2025. It feels like a long time away, but I think, as everyone on this call knows, it is going to be here before we know it. Are these the kinds of discrepancies that is an area where folks could be mobilizing the Asian American community, certainly recognizing that APIs exist in a whole lot of those swing districts, certainly here in California and Orange County, in areas throughout the nation, in Georgia and Texas and other places? Are these discrepancies something that you think will be a mobilizing factor come 2026?
I think that's absolutely right. And it's not just a discrepancy, it's a discrepancy that creates a disconnect between what people think one side is doing versus what they think the other side is doing. And this disconnect is really something that I hate to use the term messaging, but it really relies on conveying this type of data in a way people understand who's doing what policy-wise in the nation's capital. And so I very much think it's important to take the data and where there's a disconnect in terms of what's happening and why the price of eggs are still high or what have you. It's this type of data that helps us drill down, and we see it in the question about DOGE. People are definitely skeptical about DOGE in this survey, yet they also realize that the federal government is far from perfect. And obviously they've had experiences, whether it's through USCIS or through health care agency, where they've been blocked or they've hit barriers and there hasn't been much help. And so they know there are problems with the federal government. But at the same time, I think what the data is also saying is we shouldn't be taking a sledgehammer to it and just willy-nilly dismantling it. The survey also showed very few people feel like the federal government needs to be gotten rid of. So I think you're absolutely right. This type of data and the disconnect and discrepancies it's showing is really important for us, but we have to take that, and it may take until 2026 to figure out how to communicate it effectively, but that's where the challenge is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly for Democrats, I think they're definitely trying to figure out how exactly to respond to the current administration. I definitely want to bring Greg into this conversation. Greg, you, of course, are at an organization that's based in DC, but representing a coalition of Asian American organizations from across the nation. I'm so curious to hear your general reactions, and in particular, what concerns do these insights raise for you, for the many communities that the organizations who are part of NCAPA are serving?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. It's always good to see you again. I would honestly just piggyback on what Bob was getting at. Sort of, there's clearly a discrepancy in what this survey data sort of exposes as far as the attitudes and positions of the broader A and HPI community, and where the current Trump administration and government is currently operating. I think it's, one of those things about survey data is sometimes it surprises you and sometimes it doesn't, right? In this case, confirming that Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander families care deeply about affordable kind of access to healthcare, housing, quality education. That doesn't come as a surprise, right? These are core issues for every American family, Asian American families, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander families, and it's something that politicians should really pay attention to, especially when there's such a huge discrepancy in what the data is telling them and what they're choosing to do with it. I think one of the data points that really stood out to me is this idea that the respondents felt that we're actually not spending enough on some of these priorities and these programs. And it really illustrates, at least in my opinion, how disconnected the current Trump administration's approach is to what they're doing. Right. Obviously, shutting down the Department of Education is a prime example that's just out of alignment with what our community wants. And when I was thinking about this, when we heard about sort of the executive order to shut down the department, it really just struck me that some of this is not a deep policy dive that's full of kind of an academic lens. It's a simple issue. I think every family, whether you're a parent or you remember your parents, um, remember that parents have to sacrifice for their children oftentimes in order to give them those opportunities, and that's something that many would do, without hesitation. And so the idea that we want to build a championship team but not invest in a championship team kind of applies here. How can we possibly expect kind of educational outcomes to improve for our students and our kids if we're not willing to invest in that, let alone take away billions of dollars from a Department of Education that actually provides that support to schools? And so, zooming out even further, I think when you think about healthcare and, the first Trump administration spent a lot of time and resources trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which, at least again, in my opinion, and the opinion of many of our member organizations, would have devastating consequences for communities and everyone across the country. There's just sort of this pattern where we are trying, or they are trying to eliminate government agencies, all in the name of savings and efficiency. The only economic proposal that they have sort of credibly put forward is additional tax cuts that will disproportionately benefit the richest Americans. And so I think it's fair to question whether or not, this policy approach is really going to yield positive results for our community. The last thing I'll say, and sort of kind of adding an additional layer to this idea of repealing agencies, and I appreciate Karthik pointing out that future surveys will kind of do a deeper dive into specific agencies and the actions that are being taken against them. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is another federal government agency that is in the process of being repealed. And I would say for families that are concerned about cost of living, right? This is an agency that's responsible for monitoring and regulating the banks who provide mortgages, student loans, credit cards. And in taking that away and taking away that layer of protection, I believe that it opens up American consumers and our community to more scams and frauds, right? And that will ultimately increase the cost of living when suddenly your bank is charging you more and you don't realize until 6 months down the line, or your mortgage company is scamming you, much like we saw in 2008, 2009, which led to a financial crisis. And so I would say for ANCAPA and our members, we're certainly raising the alarm with decision makers here in Washington, D.C. about the real consequences that will happen if this policy approach is kind of followed through all the way.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to continue on with the conversation in just a moment, but a reminder for our attendees, please feel free to type your questions into the chat. We are monitoring that, and you can have your questions asked to the panelists themselves. So make sure to take a little bit of time with that. I wanted to turn and look a little bit more closely at some of the results that we had on immigration, in which we found that actually Asian American and Pacific Islanders respondents to this survey actually had a slightly more progressive view, wanting to see, in fact, in many instances, increases in the number of visas. I'm curious to hear from both of you how you anticipate this playing out in this current time period, but also with the communities that you serve. Prior to the president even taking office, there had actually already begun to have a back and forth on H-1B visas, in which even amongst his supporters, there's a real key difference about whether or not there should be an opportunity for more immigrants to come in the high-skilled visas as students, et cetera, from the likes of Elon Musk and others within the tech industry. And then from those within the sort of MAGA base, who of course wanted to see the full deportation and that closing of the door on immigration. I'm curious to get your thoughts about the perspectives of Asian Americans in this time period, your reflections on this data, and how it might actually, how we might need to think about the uniqueness of this time period in which we seem to see this narrative of good immigrants and less good immigrants, I'll say, being pushed forward in America. What is the response from your organizations in this time in light of this data that we're seeing?
Sure. I would love to take a swing at this because obviously immigration is such an important policy for our community. And just to maybe assuage some of Karthik's concerns about this administration taking away green cards, I just want to say, don't worry, they'll be replaced by gold cards. So, you know, we'll be all set. But all kidding aside, it is a terrifying thought that green cards could actually be reduced because obviously the immigration system would essentially grind to a halt, which is maybe what they want to do anyways. If we actually reduce green cards, clearly the community understands, the API community understands the importance of increasing the number of green cards to, you know, essentially relieve the pressure on some of the other visas you were mentioning, like the H-1B visa. And it is interesting that that high skill visa is somewhat of a wedge issue within the administration's, you know, various voices, including, as you point out, Musk on one side and Steve Bannon on the other, when it comes to the need for, you know, having people with skills that we don't have readily available here to come help with. But that's I think a battle that has yet to play out. I really don't think that based on some of the enforcement we've seen already, I don't see how this administration is going to be inclined to widen the avenues of some of these non-immigrant visas, like the H-1B and student visas. There's already a bill in the House to restrict visas to students coming from China. So you know, we see this trend, and unfortunately, it's a trend we've seen in history, a cyclical thing where we start closing off our you know our perspective with the rest of the world, and it's always ends up being to our detriment, of course. But I think the in the past, as you well know, immigration policy has been approached kind of holistically. We've tried to do border and enforcement along with better legal avenues to come. And yet in this Congress, we've already seen them do an enforcement only measure with almost no problem within the first couple of weeks with the Riley Act. So I think unlike the past, it's going to be that much harder to actually get improvements in the immigration system, be it H-1B or green card visas. But that means we have to redouble our efforts kind of get the message out that, these things that you prioritize, that our communities prioritize are going in the exact opposite direction right now. And that has to be conveyed in a way, because many in our community also believe in the importance of legal immigration and feel like enforcement is necessary, which is all understandable, but we're already seeing any number of detention and apprehension of students who were just exercising their free speech rights, but because they may have only a green card or student visa, they've been picked up and put in detention and are going to be potentially removed. So I think that's the reality of what's happening, and that needs to be communicated, I think, in a way that people understand what's happening with their priorities.
Greg, do you want to weigh in on the immigration question? And I'm particularly curious if within the NCAPA coalition, there are varying opinions about immigration amongst the organizations that you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say one of the beautiful things and challenging things about coalition work is that we have lots of really strong opinions and folks who do incredible work. And our job at NCAP is to figure out how to make all of those pieces fit. And it is true, we don't necessarily always agree on a given position, or there might be nuance within our position on immigration. And I think in reality, this moment, and certainly the actions that have been taken by the Trump administration, has actually allowed for a little bit of coalescing around the issue. I think everybody is feeling significant concern and fear about what we're seeing, to Bob's point, right? When we are talking about now targeting legal immigrants and folks who kind of came here under the same pretenses that many of our families did, right? That searching for an opportunity for a better life, that's now under threat. I think that is a sobering reality for everyone within the coalition, because it simply it flies in the face of, I think, an American ideal, this notion that we're a country where people from all walks of life can find a way here, make a living, support a family, and add to the fabric of the country. I would say pretty clearly the actions taken by the Trump administration suggest that there is a very specific kind of person that is welcome here in this country. And for almost every immigrant community, we have heard many times throughout history that we're not welcome here. And so I think it's a really tough moment. I'll be completely honest. I think the level of fear is pretty high. I mean, and understandably so. And so I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about where this stops. I would say there are open questions about kind of the long-term consequences of this approach. Certainly, many people have raised the economic factor of this. What happens when you rapidly kind of undercut a workforce that supports many of the industries in this country? And I would say the biggest concern for me is that, slamming on the brakes is easy. You go hard, and that's what they're doing. It's figuring out where you go from there. It may take a lot more time. There may be harm and damage inflicted upon our economy, upon our communities, that will take much, much longer than the few months it's been in action to actually repair. And so certainly those are questions for the future, but right now we're living in this moment of where does this ride stop and how much damage is going to be done when it's all said and done.
Great, thanks. And Karthik, I want to bring you into this as well. I mean, you've been running polls and surveys on immigration questions for quite a long time. How does this data compare to data that you've been collecting over the long haul of your work on Asian Americans? Is this in line with a consistent pattern? Do you see divergences over time? To what extent might COVID have planted any shifts in opinions of within our community?
Yeah, thank you for that, Sarah. What I would say is, I mean, what's from an academic point of view, one might say kind of fascinating, maybe from how things play out on the ground, maybe concerning, depending on one's perspective. But the dramatic shift in terms of what should happen with the undocumented or unauthorized population in this country, it's been remarkable. And it's happened over a relatively short period of time. And I think there are two things that we can point to, maybe three. One is certainly COVID. I think COVID, it all depends. Different countries have had different reactions and different implications that have flowed out of it. But I think certainly what you saw in COVID was, I mean, both as a matter of policy, even under the Biden administration, you saw first under the Trump administration, stick around a little bit for the Biden administration, and then you saw an opening of not just the border, but having more student visas and worker visas coming in. You're seeing this in Canada, you're seeing this in many other countries. But certainly COVID has something to do with it. But the bigger shift that occurred is not just among Republican voters, but among independents and to some extent Democratic voters as well. And I would credit not just the Trump campaign, but Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott and others who essentially forced the question and created a media spectacle in cities like New York, cities like Chicago, cities like Colorado, where people, basically systems started failing because they were not prepared for the influx of asylum seekers, temporary immigrants, etc. So that's where you start to see the shift where immigration starts becoming ungovernable. And it wasn't just a media spin, like it really was problems that were cropping up in places that did not see these problems before. So that's what I would attribute to a shift in when it comes to undocumented immigration. At the same time, the lived experience of Asian Americans still matters. And that's where, in the fall, we conducted a survey to ask about API opinions on legal immigration. And some of that you still see consistent now, is that people are making a distinction between the two. Some immigration advocates might decry that distinction between the so-called good immigrant and bad immigrant. This is not to say good or bad. This is just about legal status in this country. And at least in Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, you're seeing that opinion relatively stable. Whereas in the US population, there's very little data on public opinion on legal migration, but generally speaking, you're seeing a more restrictionist attitude, when it comes even to legal immigration. So I think that's going to be one of the big question marks moving forward. And under the first Trump administration, you had Senator Tom Cotton, who tried to dramatically scale back family visas. Even though that didn't go anywhere in Congress, when it came to USCIS and the time it took for them to process green cards and to process naturalizations, you saw a dramatic slowdown well before COVID. So I think it's important for us to continue to track this, but also to hold up a mirror to say, there is a distinction here. And when it comes to our community, let's stay vigilant, right? And pay attention to what's happening on the legal immigration side, especially when it comes to employer visas, when it comes to green cards, when it comes to naturalizations.
And while I have you, Karthik, I know that there had been a couple of questions in the webinar chat that were very specific to the survey itself. Taha, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, asked about where exactly you came up with the questions and the questionnaire that you used for this survey.
Great, thank you for that question. So the surveys that we do in partnership with the Associated Press and NORC, the way we ask these questions, there's basically three different ways we go about it. One, if the Associated Press and NORC have already asked the question, and especially if they've asked the question recently, we want to replicate that because we want to then not only understand where our community stands, but how it compares to the general population. So in the report, whenever you see that what we call the Gen Pop comparison, the general population comparison, we have to replicate the question in the exact same way. Next, we also come up with, sometimes we change the wording of questions to make it more appropriate to a heavily immigrant community like the Asian American community. So at times we will not replicate the question in the same way, because we have to adapt it to our communities. Some of the same concepts might read a little bit differently, especially when you're talking about in language in support in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And then finally, we come up with new questions that we think would be particularly salient or important to our community. So drilling down into different aspects of legal immigration. Right now, that is not deemed to be important enough in the public interest for others to ask detailed questions. But we know that this is a matter of interest to our communities, so we prioritize that. The questions go through a rigorous process between the API data team, the Associated Press polling team, and the NORC team. And so we do this almost on a weekly basis where we get together to look at what's on the horizon. Sometimes it's hard to predict what will be timely. What I'll say is that it's been an incredible privilege from, when I started doing this in 2008, we did surveys every 4 years. And then with APIAVote, starting in 2014, we did it every 2 years. Now we're doing it about every month or every 2 months. So there's a lot that we go into production every single time, but we are able to be timely and sometimes, ahead of the curve when it comes to issues that, in our judgment, could become very salient down the road. And then finally, I'll say that there's some seasonality to our surveys, and we try to repeat questions from prior years. So in April, for example, we'll have questions related to the environment, some of it related to Earth Day, with that seasonality. We're going to repeat some questions on education that we asked last year, and that'll be out later this spring as well.
Perfect. A long trajectory that you have had there. And then there's one more question coming from Leslie about the data as well. And I think we will all appreciate this question. Anyone who works in the API community always wants to know about disaggregated data. Leslie asks, are there any notable disaggregated findings among ethnic groups in this data set? Karthik, you wanna lead us through some of them?
Yeah, so first I'll say that I think it's important for us when we think about disaggregation, we almost always jump to ethnicity, which of course is important. But what we find in this survey, as well as in prior surveys, and we will have the gory results for you all to see soon up on our website, is that partisanship is almost often the biggest dividing line. Now, of course, there are ethnic differences in partisanship. Right? So for example, Japanese Americans and Indian Americans over time have tended to be more Democratic leaning. And other groups have been more split, Vietnamese Americans more Republican leaning. So some of that shows through in ethnicity differences as well. Depending on, so take a look at the results once we post them. We're hoping to put out more bite-sized chunks on some of the differences by gender. That depends on the topic. Nativity, especially when it comes to issues of discrimination and immigration, as you may not be surprised to know, nativity makes a difference. And it depends on the issue. Generally speaking, native-born tend to be more progressive on issues than the foreign-born. But when it comes to immigration-related issues, it all depends on the way you ask the question. So I would ask you to pay attention to that when you look at the results, say, for example, on worker visas, right? And important nativity differences. And then finally, I thought that age would show up significantly more consistently in the different surveys that we run. And I've been a bit surprised that it doesn't show up as significant as I might have expected it to. But from time to time, age does pop up in the report. If there are significant age differences, they're noted in the text or in the graphs.
Perfect. So everyone has their homework to go back and take a closer look at all of that data that's going to be coming out. There's a final question, which actually might be a really great wrap-up question, and would love to hear from each of you some of your thoughts on this. Ethan asks, how would you reconcile these surveys with how AAPI voters swung to the right in the 2024 general election. This was one of the major sort of topics of conversation in November. That coming out of the election is that more and more Asian Americans were moving towards support for Donald Trump. Certainly that was the case in other racialized and ethnic communities as well, particularly amongst men. We saw some of that swing occurring. What are your thoughts? How does this survey data respond to some of that movement? Perhaps, Karthik, this has something to do with some of the disaggregation, even on gender terms as well. Bob, do you want to start us off with some thoughts about how this data kind of reflects or doesn't reflect the results of the 2024 election?
Sure. That is a great question, and I look forward to hearing what my fellow panelists here have to say about it. But I think in part, 2024 was a culmination of mis and disinformation, kind of is almost at a high point, I think, and was just very effectively deployed, and not just outright disinformation, but almost things that had a kernel of veracity to them, and I think the Trump campaign was really effective at using these kind of social fissure points, and expanded and really did a good job of creating a divide there. And I think that they didn't necessarily hide the ball. They Project 2025 was out there for everybody to read and understand. He said on the campaign trail that he would deport college protesters over what was happening in the Middle East. And so I think nothing, they weren't hiding what they were going to do necessarily. Now, when he thought that Project 2025 wasn't popular, he tried to claim no knowledge of it, but everybody knows that that was the major, that essentially the platform for the campaign. And so but it was the effective messaging, I think, and creating that division over extreme issues, that they were very effective in painting the other side a certain way. And I think that in a large part carried the day for them, even in our communities.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Greg?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I definitely agree with Bob as far as sort of what we observed as far as misinformation, disinformation. But I'd also point out, these core issues that mattered to American voters and families before the election and after inauguration in January and even today, like they're the same, right? Like there's been economic pain and frustration being felt by millions of Americans for quite some time. And certainly this is a point of debate, but you can make the argument that is at least one of the factors that moved voters in a certain direction that led to the outcome that happened in November. But that economic pain and concern is still there. And certainly this polling shows that, right? The first few slides that we saw, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander families care about sort of family issues, whether it's costs that that are required to raise a family and help them succeed in this country. That hasn't gone away. And so I think it comes with a certain warning for the Trump administration in terms of, we really want folks to pay attention to where our community stands. I think Karthik at the beginning said, we always hear about from elected officials, oh, we don't know where the AAPI community is. Well, we do now, at least on these issues, and it's pretty stark, right? And so I would say historically, and CAP and our members have advocated with both Republicans and Democrats to say, we really need you folks, to pay more attention to where our communities are at. And, anytime a politician wants to ignore polling or ignore constituents, that comes with a certain degree of risk for them. And that's not for us to necessarily pontificate on, but in terms of advocating for our community, the data is clear, our role is clear, and we're going to continue to do that.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Greg. And Karthik, final thoughts. How does this data that we have here today reconcile anything for us coming out of the 2024 election? What might it tell us as we're moving and barreling towards 2026 as well?
Thank you, Sarah. And this is where, I'm gonna differ a little bit from my colleagues, and I think it's important. It's important for us to be able to differentiate on some of these things and to know where some of these lines of, cordial disagreement are. I would say when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, I think we need to be careful and not paint too broad of a brush. One person's misinformation is someone else's persuasion, right? And so I think I'm not saying this in a way to say that we're in a post-truth reality. I think data and evidence, API data, that's core to the work we do. But when it comes to perceptions, right, people can emphasize certain things over others. And as Greg said, the economy was dominant on people's minds. So some of it can be said, even if people feel like their rights are being threatened, right, or their membership in this society may be coming under question. They're trying to pay the bills. They're trying to take care of healthcare costs. Now, who does a better job at convincing people that they're going to solve those problems? Sometimes a sales job is more convincing than the actual work that you do. But, this is still a democratic process where one would consider that voter education, even if one vehemently disagrees with the credibility of that message. So that's one thing I want to say. I think what is so key for us to pay attention to is people might have voted for Trump or Harris or stayed at home for a variety of reasons. But this is where we are now and what we see. So what we said coming out of when we released our survey in January still holds true today. President Trump has claimed a mandate from the American public, including from Asian Americans and many other groups. We just don't see it in the data. We do see some elements. So for example, in our January survey, strong majority favors eliminating taxes on tips. Now, that's something that the administration is still trying to work on with Congress. But on so many of these other issues, we actually don't see approval or support for these matters. One of the things you'll find, by the way, when we upload the crosstabs with detailed data, as well as in the top lines, is you will see approve, disapprove for President Trump on a variety of issues. And on the economy, which arguably is the signature issue of President Trump, 70% disapprove of the job that he's doing on the economy. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind, and actually I think we need to have some grace with however people voted with the best information they had. This is the reality we're facing now, and we need to make sure that our community's needs are being addressed. And if our community is being harmed, that we have the data. We bring survey data, demographic data, policy data to bear. Greg and this incredible coalition at AAPI are bringing a lot of other perspectives with the expertise on various issues that have been built over decades and especially years of working together on this. And then APIAVote, right, with community partners throughout the country. Not just, engagement is a two-way street and learning from communities, as this is occurring. I think part of the challenge for us is there's so much happening in our communities right now that it's hard to think straight, let alone know how to act. And my hope is that as we generate this information to show the complexity in the community, but part of my hope and my tip for all of you is that if you see something like a 70-30 split, don't say that our community is divided on that issue. They are not divided on that issue. So we just need to be smart in the language that we use to know when something truly looks like a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split on a topic, or a big chunk of people that say neither this nor that, versus where the opinion is pretty sharp and pretty clear. That's what a mandate looks like. So that's one of the things I would say to you. Don't consider it homework. Just please use our information. Look for the mandates in our community, and it's usually the things that have greater than a 2/3, 1/3 split and a very clear and sharp directionality to it. So that would be my hope is, yes, we can still look back on 2024, figure out what happened, but a lot has happened since 2024. A lot has happened just in the month of March. So that would be my hope to you. That would be my ask for everyone is to please update, our understandings of where our communities are. And Greg, some of those might not surprise, but let's not be jaded, and let's not just presume that everyone knows this, because most people still don't. They think the world changed in our community in terms of what happened to our opinions in the 2024 election. And we just need to continue making sure that everyone is aware of where our communities truly stand.
That's a perfect kind of way to end this conversation and giving us a whole lot of hope. The data is there. Folks, please make sure to go out and check it out. It is available on our website. I believe that link is there in the chat, so you have access to that. Thank you so much for your engagement and participation in today's briefing. Please continue to stay up to date on these latest findings at AAPI Data and AP NORC websites, and feel free to reach out with any questions. A huge thank you to our panelists today, Bob Sakaniwa, Director of Policy and Advocacy at APIAVote, and Greg Orton, National Director of NCAPA. Enormous thanks for your participation. And of course, a huge thank you to Karthik Ramakrishnan, our founder and leader here at AAPI Data, and all the incredible work coming out of AAPI Data. Thanks so much, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.